Today on Commander Replay, we talk about the top 10 overrated cards that are actually underrated. Next on Commander Replay. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about 10 cards that are quote-unquote overrated by other YouTube channels. However, I think they're actually underrated and you should be playing them more, at least in terms of trying to give your deck power and consistency. Before we get going, I want to mention that I actually sat down and watched all of the YouTube videos where people talk about quote-unquote overrated cards, and there's a couple things that I noticed. One, don't do this because it actually wasn't that enjoyable. Two, I believe that the very first video that the Command Zone did on this subject around 2017 or so was actually done with good intent and was just like, hey, we think instead of playing these cards, you might want to try these cards. And I think the tone of that video was correct. All of the other videos after that point have really just been like clickbait and hot takes. And finally, the Command Zone has done 2 videos on this subject, and I noticed that the other channels copy the Command Zone choices a lot. And sure, maybe they feel similarly about some of these cards, but I don't know, I just feel like there's not really a need to rehash things that the Command Zone has already said, given their massive audience. So anyway, yeah, that was a few things I noticed while doing this exercise. And of course, here's my disclaimer is that I don't really care what cards you play for the most part. Sure, I have the list of cards that I don't like losing to, and I'll probably get a little salty if I lose to one of those. But in general, I'm not going to be like, that card sucks, why are you running that card? Play the cards you want. This video is more about like my disagreement with people saying, don't play these cards. And especially when I think that the cards they're talking about are very good and will only help you to make your deck more consistent. So let's get going. Number 10, Solem Simulacrum. So people have criticized Solem Simulacrum for being a little bit too slow. 4 is a little bit too much mana to ramp 1 and then draw a card later on. But the thing with Solem Simulacrum is that it actually does so much more than that. So you're paying 4 mana to ramp a land. Cool. At some point it'll die, you'll draw a card, also cool. But the other thing that Solem Simulacrum does on that 4 mana is says, no one attacks you for like the next 3 or 4 turns because they don't want to give you that card draw. Basically, you won't get attacked until someone finds evasion or the board gets wiped. And that's a really big deal. Early to the middle part of the game, you might be talking about a life swing of like maybe up to 10 damage that people might just take for free if you didn't have a blocker. But because they don't want to give you that card draw now, maybe your life total stays at 38 until like turn 8 or 9. And that makes it much harder for someone to alpha strike you or take you out of the game however they're planning to do so later on. The biggest deal with Solem Simulacrum is that it creates incentive for people to not attack you. So not only are they not attacking you, if they're a combat-focused deck, they're probably attacking someone else. So now instead of doing damage to you, they're doing damage to your opponent. So yeah, for 4 mana, this thing just does a lot. Another thing that Solem Simulacrum does, it allows you to play very passively. So you're getting a blocker in, you're ramping, and that means that if you don't want to commit a lot of stuff to the board and slow roll a board wipe, it makes it really easy to do that. Especially when you're playing against like green value decks that are probably going to dump a lot of creatures out pretty quickly. Having a board wipe around turn 5 or turn 6 can be really crucial, and Solem Simulacrum is a perfect play to set that up. You play your Solem, you've got a blocker, you've got a land. When you play the board wipe, you'll draw a card, and the green deck will usually get set back pretty significantly, and or any other deck that's just trying to put a lot of stuff onto the board quickly. And also being a passive play, playing a Solem Simulacrum won't make you the threat, but helps you set up your late game much better. And there's one final thing about Solem Simulacrum, and this will come up later on the list as well, is that Solem Simulacrum is a creature, which makes it really easy to blink, reanimate, or bounce, which means getting multiple triggers off of Solem Simulacrum is extremely powerful. The second that there's any possibility of getting a second trigger off Solem Simulacrum in your deck, easily makes it worth running. So yes, even though Solem Simulacrum may look like pay 4, ramp, and draw a card, it does so much more than that. There's so many little things that go on with Solem Simulacrum that it's easy to miss, and that's why I think you should be running Solem Simulacrum more as opposed to less. Number 9, Cultivate and Kodama's Reach. I'll be honest, I don't truly understand how people can call these overrated. I'll reference the Command Zone stat episode once again. I know it's a few years old now, and things have changed a little bit, but their stats basically said 2 things. The player with the most lands is most likely to win the game by a pretty significant amount, and the player who won the game had 10 to 11 lands in play. So if you want to think of a game of Commander as a race to 10 lands, I wouldn't fault you for doing so. Sure, there can be a little bit more subtlety and nuance to it than that, but realistically, the player with the most lands who still has some cards in hand to cast is probably ahead. Cultivate and Kodama's Reach will only ever do good things for you. You ramp one and you set up your next land drop, and in a format where it's frowned upon for people to run checks against people playing too many lands, there's absolutely no reason to not ever run these. Oh, this is so beautiful. Alright, so I just jumped over to EDH Rec real quick because I was curious to see what the percentage of Cultivate in decks was. It says 50% right here. But check this out, right in the corner we got Cultivate as an overrated card. I disagree so much. This number, 50%, this should be 95%, and that 5% should be CEDH decks only. If you are playing any non-CEDH green deck, you should be running Cultivate. So in a format where the most important thing is literally having lands in play, there's no way that any card that puts lands in play can be overrated. That's just not a thing that can happen. And to prove that Cultivate is not an overrated card, let's go through a little thought experiment. Let's imagine it's anywhere between turns 2 and 4 of a game of Commander. You're playing a mono red deck, and you've got red open and a Reverberate in your hand. If someone casts a Cultivate, you will Reverberate that Cultivate in a heartbeat, because you know that getting that extra land into play and turning one card into 2 cards is also card advantage, so now you've ramped and you've set up your next land drop, you're staying on par with that green deck and probably getting ahead of 2 other players. So yeah, in a format where the most powerful thing you can do is have more lands in play than your opponent, there's no way cards that put lands into play can be overrated. It's just not possible, because it's literally doing the strongest thing you can do in the format. Number 8, Force of Will. So it's easy to pick on Force of Will as being a bad counterspell, which it kind of is, but again, there's some subtlety here, and maybe it's not even that subtle, is that if you're running Force of Will, this allows you to do a couple things. If someone tries to drop a Mana Crypt or a Soul Ring on turn 1 and you haven't had a turn yet, depending on what that game looks like, it may make sense for you to counter that early Mana Rock play, because when you talk about CEDH and near CEDH decks getting a Mana Crypt into play on turn 1, they can do some really powerful things way ahead of when they're supposed to do them, and it might make sense to eat the card advantage from Force of Will and slow them down, so now they have to play at the same speed as everyone else. And there's also a good chance that when someone keeps a hand with Mana Crypt or Soul Ring, oftentimes the rest of that hand is really bad if that Mana Crypt or Soul Ring doesn't survive. So you may be able to just take them out of the game because they were relying on all of that fast mana that they were going to have, and there may only be 1 or 2 lands in their hand otherwise, and they might not actually be able to cast anything if you counter that Mana Rock on the way in. But there's other stuff too. So the big thing with Force of Will is that you can tap out and make a bunch of proactive plays on your turn and not get punished for your opponent making some big, possibly game-ending play on their turn while you've spent all your mana. That's what Force of Will allows you to do. Now, to take this even a step further, your opponent may or may not know that you run Force of Will, so if they tap out all their mana for a giant Torment of Hailfire and you Force of Will it because you were tapped out, you not only stopped a probably game-ending play, you've also basically made them lose their entire turn. Because if they spent all their mana trying to make that play, they probably can't do that much else. And I get it, people criticize Force of Will for the lack of card advantage. You're blue, you draw cards. If I'm piloting a white deck, and the cost is I can exile 2 cards from my hand to stop a Torment of Hailfire, I will play that 100% of the time. If the cost of not losing the game is 2 cards, I'm fine with that. I will happily pay 2 cards to not lose the game right now. And then beyond that, then there's the situation where opponents know that you may be running Force of Will. Now they need to play differently even when you're tapped out. If you know they're running Force of Will, Pact of Negation, any other free counterspells, you now have to respect that, and you can't just do all the things you want expecting that nothing will go wrong. So yeah, Force of Will, the card advantage is costly, but you're blue, there's plenty of ways to draw. And if the cost of not losing the game is 2 cards, then you'll pay 2 cards pretty much every time. Number 7. Speaking of drawing cards, Harmonize. I get it. There's a lot of ways to draw cards in green, and now there's becoming a lot of ways to repeatably draw cards in green, and all of those things are certainly very attractive. However, they do have conditions, and however easy it is to meet those conditions, there are points in a game where you won't be able to meet them. Harmonize is unconditional card draw. So even if a player like myself just finished firing off an Hour of Revelation and the only thing left in play is lands, you can still draw 3 cards with Harmonize, which can potentially get you more lands or more gas. So it's not the type of card that usually wins you the game, it's the type of card that keeps you from not losing the game, because you're still just looking at a few extra cards, probably making your next land drop maybe 2, and hopefully finding at least 1 card that's impactful. So yeah, the role of Harmonize is very different than something like Rishkar's expertise. Rishkar's expertise is probably game-winning amounts of card draw. Harmonize is the type of card draw that keeps you from losing the game, but won't necessarily win it for you. And it's easy to play at a point in the game where you can spend your mana drawing cards without having to impact the board. To really put it into perspective, if they printed this in red or white, it immediately goes into every red or white deck that doesn't have better card draw colors in it. Drawing 3 cards with no additional questions asked is really powerful, and especially being able to do it at the point in the game where you would normally be able to cast a Harmonize. Number 6, Lightninggreaves. I honestly don't know how this card can be called overrated. It's so incredibly good. On a very low mana cost, you get 2 abilities that can fairly dramatically alter the game. First, let's talk about Shroud. Shroud literally shuts off all forms of spot removal against whatever creature you put the Greaves on. Oftentimes it's going to be your commander. Your entire deck is built around your commander. It is really important to keep your commander in play. Not keeping your commander in play is a good way to lose games. When you have your commander plus Lightninggreaves, they need to have the mana and the card to kill your commander ready to go as you try to equip the Greaves, and they may not. If they draw that card a turn too late, too bad. The Greaves are already on there. The second ability is Haste. Now you can use your commander right away, either attacking or activating some ability, all of which can be super relevant. In addition to that, just dropping some other big nasty creature that you want to attack with and attacking with it right away. Haste is a big deal in Commander because you're taking away the ability for the other 3 players to react at sorcery speed. And that's huge. Most board wipes in Commander are sorcery speed. One of the best examples I can give you is the difference between an Atali with haste and an Atali without haste. Those are 2 really different cards because when Atali doesn't have haste, people are probably going to try and shoot it because if you leave it long enough, it will win the game. But Atali with haste means you're generating value. You're getting extra cards off the top of people's libraries, and sometimes that's enough to win the game on the spot, sometimes it's a few turns later. But you've now generated a ton of value that just makes it so much more difficult for your opponents to answer your board state. Another thing to consider is that people run more spot removal than they used to. Board wipe counts have gone down, spot removal counts have gone up, and again, you're literally shutting off all forms of spot removal with Lightninggreaves. And in a format where we talk about things needing to be immediately impactful, Lightninggreaves gives you all of that on a 2-mana artifact. So simply having Lightninggreaves versus not having Lightninggreaves makes you threat assess the table so much differently, and I've been seeing myself and a lot of other players just shooting the Greaves early in a game because of how much it can alter the game, especially in the later turns when people have a lot of mana. Lightninggreaves alters your board state too much for it to ever be an overrated card. It's just really good, and running it will only help you protect your commander and use your things immediately, thus making your deck more effective. Number 5. I don't even know how this one made it on a list, honestly. This is a CEDH staple. We're talking about none other than Sylvan Library. This is a card that I complain about often because it's OP, and there's nothing about this card that says green. I get it, it's from Legends. I get it, the card was printed in 1994, and they didn't have any idea what they were doing back then, but like, there's just nothing else in the game that does what Sylvan Library does, and it's absolutely ridiculous. Being able to look at the top 3 cards of your library and then choose to draw them at the cost of life is huge, and especially starting on turn 2. Even if you don't draw the extra cards, Sylvan Library is almost like brainstorming every turn, and people run singleton copies of Brainstorm in their deck. So if you're talking about doing that multiple times in a game, obviously the card is very good. And like I've talked about a number of times already, is getting lands into play is really important. If you don't have a land in hand, Sylvan Library gives you a really good opportunity to draw a land to make your next land drop on your turn, and that's such a big deal. And Sylvan Library is just incredible at allowing you to set up your next few turns really efficiently, or you can crack fetches and shuffle if you don't like the cards that are on top. Now, I get it, there will be times where you're just like, I need gas, and you look at the top 3 with Sylvan Library and you're like, ooh, that's a lot of lands. So just because Sylvan Library is in your deck doesn't mean that you won't ever need other card draw ever. No, you probably will at some point because the cost of 4 life per card is rather high. and I would definitely run some life gain in your deck if you're running Sylvan Library. If you're playing Sylvan Library and you find yourself getting stuck, that probably points to other problems in deck building. It's because your deck isn't built properly, you probably don't have enough ramp removal or a card draw, or the curve is too high, or something like that. And those aren't problems with Sylvan Library, that's a problem with the rest of the deck. Sylvan Library is only ever going to help you try to achieve your goals with a particular deck. Next up, number 4, Miraris Wake. This is a mana doubler. Like we've talked about already, being able to produce the most mana is the most surefire way to win a game of Commander. Miraris Wake and other mana doublers will only help you do that. I get it, you need to untap with them. There's that whole turn cycle where you hold your breath and wait for the card to come back, and that you get to untap with it and use all of your mana. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. But the times that you do, you're going to be really far ahead. As a little thought exercise, I want you to think about ramp like this. So many people talk about needing to ramp on 2 with a Signet. Over the course of a normal game of Commander, an early game Signet will probably produce you 8 to 10 mana or so. If you untap with Miraris Wake and make your next land drop, that's 6 extra mana. If you're allowed to have a mana doubler for several turns of a game, you're probably producing anywhere between like 20 and 50 extra mana, where like I said, any Signet you drop probably going to top out around 10 additional mana produced. Mana doublers are insane, and will only ever help you be able to do more of the things that you want to do while playing your deck. Number 3, the worst, I mean best, of all the mana doublers, Zendikar Resurgence. This is the mana doubler that is also a win condition. You play this in a green deck, and when you untap, you generally proceed to cast most of your deck. Is it 7 mana? Yes. Does green care about mana? No, not really. Green is able to produce so much mana now that when you see someone regularly cast 50 cards from their deck by turn 6, you realize that mana is no longer a constraint for green. Sure, it says a casting cost of 7 at the top, but you assemble 2 or 3 different cards, and that just doesn't matter anymore. Zendikar Resurgence is a card that must absolutely be shot if you see it in play, because if someone untaps with a Zendikar Resurgence, you've probably already lost the game. On occasion, you will survive that. If they untap with it a second time, there's almost no chance that you're going to survive the game. The amount of value and the amount of mana and the amount of cards that they'll draw is just going to surpass probably anything that you're doing. Number 2, Chromatic Lantern. So this one's far less exciting, it's not as big and splashy as some of the other things we talked about, it's also cheaper than a lot of cards on this list. But mana production is so crucial to the game that I don't understand how anyone could call this card overrated. So I get it, there's a lot of criticism for 3 mana rocks that only produce 1 mana, and in general, I stay away from those, other than Chromatic Lantern. And that's because there's a ton of mana rocks at 2 that also produce 1 mana. So I get it, Chromatic Lantern is not as fast as those. But so many people talk about the format in this light of ramping on 2 and getting to 4 mana on turn 3 means you've won the game. In CEDH maybe, but everywhere else, no. The game doesn't end because you hit a Signet on 2 and ramp to 4 mana on turn 3. In all likelihood, the game's gonna go probably 7 or 8 turns, at least. But the upside of this card is that you now no longer need to think about what color of mana your lands are producing. This does a lot of really powerful things, so I would say that most people recognize this as a staple for any deck with 3 or more colors. And totally legit. You got 3 or more colors, run a Chromatic Lantern, it's going to make your life easier when you draw it. And especially as someone who played Sir Gwyn a lot, Sir Gwyn has atrocious mana. Most of the knights are like double and triple white, and Sir Gwyn wants Mardu, and you're trying to ramp there quickly, which means you're probably using like Wont, Power Stone, Hedron Archive type stuff in addition to your Signets, so there's a lot of colorless mana floating around. You're also trying to get some good utility lands in your deck. The mana colors in Sir Gwyn and in a lot of Mardu combat decks can be pretty atrocious. Chromatic Lantern solves all of those issues. I also play 5-color Sisay deck, where you're trying to make Wooburg stacks of lands. Chromatic Lantern, beautiful in that deck, just amazing. But let's talk about some decks where it's a little bit less obvious. When you take a look at something like my Weapons of War deck, and if I'm playing that build online, I have perfect access to fetches and dual lands. If you pay attention to my mana base, most of the games that I play with that deck, I have exactly red, red, white, white, and then a bunch of colorless mana. So I have exactly what I need to cast Aurelia, color-wise, and not more than that, at least until the game gets later. So if you keep an eye on my decks, if you ever saw me randomly draw a Kiki Jiki or a Cavalier of Flame, around like maybe turn 5 or turn 6 of an Aurelia game, I probably don't have triple red to cast that card. So my land base isn't built in a way to be able to really produce triple red easily or quickly. And that's because I'm also trying to get some really impactful colorless utility lands into the deck. And those can be really important, so even if you're running a 2-color deck, especially if you're not in green, being able to make all of your lands tap for any color, it solves a lot of problems. It means that you only need to care about the amount of mana and not the colors of mana. And I get it, some people will be like, no, just build your mana base better, but it's still something you're going to have to keep track of. How much of each color am I able to produce versus how much of each of those color are in my hand that I need to cast? Chromatic Lantern removes that point of tracking from you. It's no longer a thing that you need to worry about. You can now think about other things that are more important than, do I have enough colors to be able to cast these cards that I want to cast? And where this is also relevant, suppose the opposite side of the coin, you don't have a perfect mana base, you don't have fetches, shocks, duels, and even in a 2-color deck, your mana can get weird sometimes. If you have a lot of basics, sometimes you draw a lot of the basic you don't need, you need the other one. Chromatic Lantern solves that problem. So yes, Chromatic Lantern isn't the type of card that you just cast and immediately win the game, but it's a type of card that allows you to keep your focus on other things that matter more than keeping track of which colors you have to cast the cards you want to cast. Number 1, the final card. This is the one that I took issue with the most out of watching all these videos, and the video that this was in has actually been out for a while. But I still remember my reaction to it when that video came out. When the command zone said that Eternal Witness is overrated, use Regrowth instead. This is the one that I found genuinely upsetting, because Eternal Witness is so much more than Regrowth can ever possibly be. Plain and simple, Eternal Witness is one of the most abusable creatures in this format. Many games will end when someone goes Eternal Witness, get back Living Death, and there's a sack outlet. Many games will also end when someone goes Eternal Witness, get Devastation Tide. Have you ever seen what Sun Titan and Eternal Witness can do together? The point is that Eternal Witness is a creature, and like we talked about with Solem Simulacrum, all the same rules apply. You can blink, bounce, reanimate, or in any myriad of ways trigger multiple ETBs off of Eternal Witness and do some really crazy things. Have you ever fed an Eternal Witness to a Skull Clamp? I bet you have. Have you ever used an Eternal Witness to block a giant creature that's attacking you that doesn't have trample? Have you ever sacked Eternal Witness to an Ashnod's altar to get mana to be able to cast the thing that you got out of the graveyard with Eternal Witness? The point is, these are all things that Eternal Witness can do that Regrowth can never do. For 1 more mana, Eternal Witness is 10 times the card that Regrowth could ever be. Eternal Witness is basically like a 1-card combo in any combination of colors that your deck is in. You can safely assume that in the mid to later turns of a game, if you see an Eternal Witness and the graveyards haven't been exiled at all, you're probably in trouble. Doing anything twice in Commander is really powerful. Being able to play your best card again, quite honestly, that's what wins are made of. If you can play your best card more times than anyone else, you're probably going to win the game. So yeah, Eternal Witness is 10 times the card that Regrowth could ever be, because of its ability to combo with just about everything, because of the ability to get multiple triggers, and the ability to sack it, block it, reanimate it, blink it, bounce it, all make this card insane. And when the Command Zone guys talked about this one, I did find this one a little bit upsetting, because Eternal Witness does so much more than Regrowth. And yeah, I get that it's 1 mana cheaper, but that 1 mana does a lot of extra things that you probably want in your Commander deck. So anyway, yeah, these are my 10 overrated cards that are actually underrated. I think you should be running them more and not less. So looking at this list, many of the cards on this list have to do with ramp or card draw, which I did find interesting. I also found it interesting that a lot of the cards on this list happen to be green, which I did spend a little bit of time thinking about, and I think people call these cards overrated because there's such an abundance of riches in green that you have more than one choice when it comes to how you want to ramp and how you want to draw. If you color shift any of the green cards on this list, they become incredible, and there's no question about how good they actually are. The only way to make Cultivate and Kodama's Reach overrated is that there are like 200 other ways to ramp in green. No other color has that. You make those literally any other color, and it's a 100%er in basically any deck. So anyway, yeah, I think it's incorrect for people to say, these cards are overrated, don't run these cards, because most of the cards on this list help you with ramp and card draw, and sure, there may be other ways to fill these same roles, But you definitely can't go wrong with these tried and true staples, because they will only help to make your deck more consistent. So anyway, I'm gonna wrap it up there. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, feel free to comment, like, or subscribe. Thank you for watching. Hey guys, in addition to my TCG affiliate player link, I now have an affiliate link with Flipside Gaming, an LGS from my hometown. You can use the promo code REPLAY to save 10% on your next order over $10. Both affiliate links are in the description below. I want to thank my awesome Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. If you want to help support the channel and vote on which decks I play next, feel free to check out my Patreon at the link below.